Well, I had a wonderful time speaking with Andrew the other week on various topics. The apathetic subject. We talked about the relation between origin and original, and various issues that come up in a lot of net conversations, that come up in a lot of OG Rose conversations, that come up between Andrew and I as we're talking, and then different people in the various circles that we work with, and that was really a blast. And we thought it'd be fun to do it again, and then again and again, because it's really great. And to really start talking about some maybe of the kind of social issues of the social organization, maybe foundational kind of issues in that realm. But we will see. But Andrew, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I can't wait to get into it again and again and
Absolutely.
get to the bottom of whatever's going on, So
Yes, indeed, indeed, indeed. But Andrew, before we got talking, I know you had a question that was an interesting one to start with, so I'll just throw it to you to ask that, and we'll go from there.
so we were talking about just like this shared negativity
Mm,
in a society. And this is, I guess, maybe jumping the gun in terms of needing to talk about society's relationship to the logic, the AA logic or
mm,
the AB logic. But I'm very curious about how it's possible to have a shared negativity when, in my eyes, this negativity has to be entailed with how people appropriate the value in their life and
mm,
how they get to the point in which value is realized.
mm,
Um, so uh, I'll just say, to me, value is deeply related to content that's purpose serving.
mm.
It's purposeful. It's it's contingent to like, to me, it's like with Plato when he talks about what is good. It's very much related to good being something's value, its purpose being active to a significant degree. And that, to me, is what uh, good is, and how people, when they are in a society and they value something, they're valuing it based off what they think is good, what they think is purposeful to a significant degree to them. So I just want to start you off with that loaded question.
No, that's excellent. I think it ties together with the AB versus the AA. So it's interesting when we talk about a shared negativity, because a shared negativity can mean an absence of, it can mean a shared, say, pain, it can mean a shared openness. There's different ways. Now, ontologically, say, if we're talking about negativity, that would be kind of the notion of there being an essential incompleteness to the human subject, which could be Gödel, obviously Zizek, Hegel, different people will talk about this, which is the idea that subjectivity cannot complete itself. It can't be a complete system. Now, right there, that's going to be a main tenet of a movement from AA logic to AB logic, because in AA logic, the self equals the self. It is a internally consistent system. It is able to complete itself. It's able to find a stable identity and to be that and to kind of practice that stable ability or express that stable identity. And AB logic would be to say that whatever A defines itself as, there is always a B that the A is without. Because the moment you say that A equals B, well, then A is an A, right? A is B. But then if you say B is B, well, then B doesn't equal A. So there's always a paradoxical kind of oscillation that will be occurring ontologically when you talk about AB. And the full formula from the On A is A paper that is captured by the phrase AB is that A does not equal A in parentheses equals A does not equal A in parentheses without B. Now that's a mouthful, and I don't say that every time, but the notion is that a thing is not what it is, always being what it isn't, while toward a stable notion of what it is. And that's kind of strange. But like, so for example, take this bookcase. If I were to say, well, the bookcase is the bookcase, Well, what's that exactly? You could get into the ship of thesis. You could say it's the handles. Well, if I take the glass away, is it still a bookcase? What essentially makes a bookcase, right? It's actually quite difficult to locate. You say, well, it holds books. You say, well, a shelf holds books, right? And you keep going and you have this argument and you find, as we all know, it becomes extremely difficult to actually define what makes a bookcase essentially a bookcase. And even if you say that a bookcase is essentially something that holds books, well, what makes that phenomenon a bookcase, right? I use it to hold books, but I could put pots in it. I could put cups in it. I could use it for different things, right? So it's all relative to use. Well, here's the thing. That means that phenomenon of which I cannot locate within it essential bookcaseness is ultimately used as a bookcase because I make it toward what it is without, which is that essential bookcaseness. So I take this phenomenon and decide that it is a bookcase and thus treat it and make it one. And thus it becomes a bookcase, the without be, that it becomes because I'm able to do that. Because the phenomenon does not keep me from using it as a bookcase, because it's without it, but it also doesn't have a stable identity, I'm actually able to turn it into a thing that has that function. But the moment I go to look for that function in the essence of the object itself, I'm not going to locate it, of course, right? Because ultimately it's arbitrary. The form is something I press down upon the phenomenon, right? So there's this weird oscillation where indeed that thing over there is practically a bookcase. It would kind of be silly to say it's not a bookcase, and yet the moment I try to defend and locate the essence of bookcase in the phenomenon, I cannot do it. And so it's gone. So suddenly the bookcase is like gone. And then when I go back to my everyday life, it goes back to functioning as a bookcase. So it's always this unstable identity is always toward the stable identity that the phenomenon itself is without. Now, that's a whole lot to say, but likewise, that applies to, say, an identity of Daniel. So I, say, well, I'm Daniel. And if you would ask me, well, who is Daniel? And I would say, well, Daniel, he's married to Michelle. He has 3 kids. He writes under O.G. Rose, and you start going, well, those are all descriptions of Daniel, but who is Daniel in essence, right? And then suddenly it becomes quite difficult. You're like, how do I do that? And yet, because I am able to have the idea of Daniel, of which I, as a kind of stable definition, am without, I'm able to function as if I'm Daniel. And so there's a kind of negativity, right? There's a kind of lack, which is the stable identity. And yet, because I'm able to think about Daniel, I'm still able to practice and carry myself as if I am Daniel, even though I can't locate that essence in the phenomenon of me itself. So where in AA logic, you actually do think that you can locate that stable identity in the phenomenon, where in AB logic, all definition entails a certain lack. There's a certain negativity of which then allows, but here's the trick. So there's a few things. The first way to interpret that is kind of pessimistic. You're like, oh, well, it sounds like all identity is a kind of illusion, right? It's always a kind of arbitrary designation. But another way to look at it is that all phenomenon, precisely because they lack a stable essence, are engaged in a becoming, a creative becoming of that notion that you see it as. So I can't locate the essence of Daniel in this phenomenon that is my body and in me. But because I cannot do that, it is possible for me to be creatively organized toward the ideas of who I think I am and to move in that direction. So one of the key things is that you have negativity that can be an absence that's kind of discouraging because it makes it seem like nothing is. But then there's another form of negativity that is the precondition that makes possible creative becoming, where you can never say in the ship of thesis, find at what point when you take the parts away of the ship, it stops being a ship, right? You take away the oars, when does it stop? And there's something about that that's disturbing. But you see, the very fact that you can't necessarily separate the whole in the parts means that you can always have parts being added to our understanding of what is the ship, changing our definition of what is the ship. And the notion of ship can always be creatively reconstituted and becoming, right? Precisely because it works in the other way. If you can't take away the parts of the ship and define a clear point where it ceases to be a ship, where it goes the other way, well, you could add to the ship and it continued to be a ship, but in new ways, in new possibilities. Maybe you could put wings on the side, right? And now it's a ship boat, right? So one of the key ideas is that a shared negativity, in order to be shared, would have to move in the direction of people seeing it as a creative becoming. Because you put it very well on the shared purpose, right? Like if people don't have a shared purpose, it seems very difficult in order to have a shared society, because there's a lack of a first principles by which we could communicate, right? So what has to happen is that for a very long time, and we talked about it last time, people have had their shared purpose be based on something that they've come from, like their origin, or they say, oh, I was born in this family, oh, I'm a Christian, and this is the shared ground. And you mentioned this before, where we talk to one another, where a society that's going to be talking instead about a shared negativity is instead going to be unified by the ground of almost the final cause more than the first cause, to use Aristotle's language. Where before it would be like, what's kind of the cause that is all moving us, forward, because it kind of moved from us in our history and our tradition. Well, to start talking about shared negativity is going to be talking about a shared creative cause, something that is pulling us forward collectively, that we are becoming as opposed to pushed by. Now, that's very kind of scary, because when you can find your identity in a previous cause that you're participating in, like a kind of AA, you say, oh, I'm part of the Christian tradition. Oh, I'm part of America. Oh, I'm part of this society. It kind of gives you a definition that then pushes you along. But if instead you start talking about, no, there's a space here for us to become something different, to create something different, well, then that's something you take responsibility for and something you think about. And the shared negativity then becomes the shared opening for the possible, right? The very fact that you lack a stable identity then means you have an identity that can become something, that can change. Also, a shared negativity would mean that you really can never close yourself off from the other entirely, because a negativity is also an opening. Like if your identity cannot be its own full constitution, then everything around you that you're relating to is part of your definition and part of your becoming and part of who you are. So you have to be open to the other, right? So in that openness to the other, if they likewise are open to you, then that is going to have a shared relationship that's going to be shaping you in different ways. A lot of the shift too would there be, when you talk about a kind of a shared negativity, it's kind of the difference where for thousands of years, basically, we've had a shared presuppositions, shared ground. But now one is talking about a shared openness to one another, which would mean the foundations for our thinking, a term from the net, is intersuppositional, in the space between people that's holding us up as opposed to something under us. And this would basically mean that what is holding us together is not a ground that we're shared on, but it's almost like a string that's pulling you toward that creative becoming. It's not really under you, but there's something that's pulling you and keeping you from falling into the board. Makes me think of Faulkner's description of the seagulls and the Quentin concept, where they're pulled on an invisible wire kind of forward. And that's much more intersuppositional as opposed to presuppositional. So the first thing I will say, and then give it back to you, is that a shared negativity is a shared lack, which then is a shared opening. And the way that you can have a shared ground is one of the shared purposes would be to keep that opening, to keep that lack an opening, not just a deconstructive sort of effacement, where you say, oh, we're incomplete, so what's the point? And you kind of fall away. As opposed to saying, no, we're incomplete, therefore we can be open to one another, to complete one another in a mutually shared becoming. And part of the shared purpose is a commitment to maintain that openness and to do the psychological, mental, emotional work to have that openness. So the first thing it would require is a very, very mature subject, a very mature development of the subject to be able to handle that level of openness. And look, if there's a sense in which first principles and a shared ground is no longer possible, then that sort of maturity of the subject to be able to handle a level of openness to the other is going to prove utterly necessary. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to have a certain desperate return to a ground, of which then in AA thinking, you close yourself off to the other, except people like you. So the other thing I
Right.
would say, and then I'll give it to you, in AA societies today are very tribal, right? They become very sort of find people who think like you, find people who believe the same conspiracy, find people and shut off from one another, okay? Because you want to defend your internally consistent system, your AA, and therefore the other is a threat. Like the other is a threat in AA because they may unveil that your AA is not internally consistent or that it's based on assumptions or axioms that you can't ground yourself. Whereas an AB society, far from viewing the other as a threat, believes it needs the other, in fact, to engage in becoming and to actually escape our tendencies to self-enclose ourselves in our logic. Because the other is a revelation that other people can have other non-rational axioms for their worldviews and how they think. And then that makes us think, oh, well, then why do I think the way that I think? And how can this other person help me transform in that? So there, the first thing that just comes to mind is in AA, the other is a threat. In AB, the other is a necessity. In AA, openness is stupid and irrational because why would you be open? Someone could show that you're wrong. Where in AB, openness is ontologically justified because the very ontological nature of things is incomplete. So to not be open is to not actually be true to how things are. Like if things entail an essential incompleteness, then you're actually not acting fitting if you're not open because you're treating things as if they're closed when they are not. So there's also an alignment with how things really are ontologically. And that's why I say arguing Hegel or taking seriously Gödel or all these other things is quite important because that then shapes what is the fitting way to be relative to how you think the nature of the world actually is like. So those arguments matter. So the role of the other is the first thing that really changes quite a lot.
That was fantastic. Okay, so to me, there seems to be this um, there seems to be this preconditioned work that's going on prior to the evaluation of what value is. So uh, clearly, value, like when an individual is assessing their life, I think most people are assessing their life in terms of whatever value means to them. But we're talking about what you're talking about is before you even can get to that point of making a valuation, you have to understand, and I'm keeping in mind just like how I defined value. You have to understand the contextual threshold in which the purpose serving thing is doing. So it seems that an A-B logic is seeing the contextual threshold, like what is their context, what is relevant in their value assessment. It's just fundamentally different than someone in an AA way of looking at what is relevant to them. So I just think that everything you're saying is right, and it makes sense to me. But how do you get somebody who's already situated in appropriating their value in an AA way? How do you make that paradigm shift that doesn't seem to, I guess, like destroy your sense of self completely? And then another comment that I had was, so the shared openness, this creative cause, the shared creative cause, the string that you're talking about, it seems to be a semantic string to me. So like a metaphysics of semantics, a way of looking at one word, for example, and understanding that you can have multiple sentiments to that word, and that you can communicate with each other, understanding that how you value the word comes from a semantic place. So you have a semantic valuation of the word. In that sense, you don't put all your marbles into the one possible semantic view of the word, because you understand that it's semantics and that it's very context based. Like, what is a good walk? You know, what is a walk? Even a walk could be a form of exercise or a way to go to the convenience store to get groceries. It seems that we need to have a more of a, when you say mature understanding, I agree. I feel like you could easily translate it in terms of like a semantic understanding. And one more thing with this semantic understanding, how you target and pinpoint the value in the thing has to be something that's like, it seems like objectively gradable. Like if you were to make an evaluation on like basketball, you can say, out of what players that are amateur, like there's an objective, term of what amateur is. You're not in the NBA, for example. So if you're not in the NBA, you're an amateur. And if you're 6'5", these are objective measurements. Then you can have like, to me, this semantic approach where you're taking things into account that are deeply based off the context in which that account is dwelling in. So let me know if I should recap or if everything follows. But yeah, I'll pass it.
Excellent, excellent. Everything you said is extremely spot on. In regard to the semantic difference, there's a lot of truth to that. So in AA thinking, I would go say, for example, I believe in freedom. And I tend to think then that freedom is kind of a self-justifying and complete concept, right? Where I'd go, okay, it's free. But in AB thinking, that's when you realize that, say, there's a point where freedom becomes oppressive, actually. And so, for example, you're free from the electricity company. You're free from having to go to work. And you say, well, that's great. But the issue is now you don't have money and you can't take care of your family, right? You're free, but now it's anarchism and there's no society, right? So there's a point where actually freedom no longer is good. Well, that would mean some other value has to be incorporated to freedom to keep it from being good. So, for example, justice. Like if everyone's free, but there's no justice, well, then it would be oppressive. And in fact, the strong will just take care, the strong will just dominate the weak, right? But then let's say you have justice and you don't have freedom. Well, that doesn't sound too good because that could be oppressive. Who gets to decide what is justice? You want to have people all freely pursuing their own just ends, right? Not just having a single notion of justice that's applied on other people. Well, hold on. What if people pursue freely just ends that oppress other people, right? Well, then you have to have law in order to kind of find the spaces between those things. And then you have to talk about equality. And then you have to talk about all these different things. So a lot of times in AA thinking, what ends up happening is we tend to really forget that every value eventually reaches a point where it no longer is that very value. Like freedom at a certain point becomes oppressive, and so it is no longer free. Justice at a certain point becomes oppressive, so it's no longer just, right? Well, that's an AB revelation, actually. And if everyone in your society realized that every single value is only valuable to the degree it is in concert with all the other values, well, that's going to get everyone to be thinking in terms of, okay, what is the proportion of each value relative to a certain situation? Over here, we need 70% freedom, 20% justice, 10% equality or whatever. Over here, it's actually more of a justice thing where we need to really bring in 80% of justice. And you have a debate on those terms, right? So that would really radically transform the nature of the discourse right there. If you really, for me, the first step out of everything, if I were to do this in order, because the first question on wouldn't this destroy people, a lot of truth to that. So how do you gradually introduce people to that? For me, the first step is actually the realization, getting people to truly realize that their deepest held values, if overfit is the term I use, overfit become oppressive. Because then that makes everyone realize that, wait a minute, it's not that liberals and conservatives have different values, they have different emphases. I've never met a liberal that doesn't think, I've never met a liberal who hates freedom. I've never met a conservative that hates equality, right? They just disagree on the ordering or the emphasis, or if regulating business is a violation of freedom or not. So it's not that they share different values, is that they disagree on the ordering of the values, right? But what ends up happening is that people actually forget that and then actually do speak as if they're mono-value, as if they actually come to act as if a single value can do everything. But if you get everyone to realize that we're actually debating at what point a value requires its other, other, A, B. At a point, freedom needs justice to continue to be freedom, right? Well, then people start to become existentially habituated and comforted with complexity and difference, and not thinking in terms of a mono theory. So they have to start thinking in terms of, okay, at what point am I willing to limit, say, the justice that I think is the most important thing in the world? Or at what point am I going to limit the freedom that I think is the most important thing in the world, precisely so that freedom stays good, right? Well, then that's going to begin training them to think in a nuanced, complex way that's kind of a B, and also a gradient where the freedom slides into justice and justice slides into freedom, and then you have to be paying attention to see that movement, right? Well, right there is going to start being a little bit of existential and emotional training, right? That's going to begin, because with your first question, it makes me think of the dilemma, like I've always mentioned with Dante, of how God has to gradually unveil himself, because if he unveils himself all at once, it destroys you, right? So it has to be a gradual, as Dante climbs, Beatrix can smile more, or otherwise he gets eradicated. So there has to be in the society kind of a process of accustoming people to thinking beyond self-enclosure, or thinking beyond a kind of single value, right? Which, again, I will note, very important, it is natural to be AA. The brain is naturally AA. AB is not natural. Thinking naturally presents things as stable identities. That's how it comprehends. So when we're talking about AB, that's going to require very active awareness of how the brain is always trying to slip back into AA, or engage in self-deception, or to practically act as if a single value is all we need. Okay, so it's going to require a kind of active work to make sure we don't do that. Please.
That active work, just following here, that active work is contingent off of the other.
Mm-hmm.
The contingency isn't off of you per se, it's off of the other. And that makes me think, is there just one other?
No.
Like with the bookcase, for example, the contextual threshold of the bookcase could, the bookcase affords the ability to also be like a cookie jar holder.
Absolutely.
It affords other things than just casing books. It can case other things.
Yes.
So if you, in your house, the mini Gardner Society, everyone wants their own take on what the shelf is. How do you go from there then? Sure. That's what I mean by, is there just one other? Is it just do you need to look at it in terms of the group, the Gardner family, or would you look at it in terms of okay, there's my wife, and then I have to talk to, is it each individual? Not to go off on a tangent.
No, because that's exactly, because you could also say, well, maybe the bookcase should be turned over and the back of it should be a table. Maybe it should be torn up and resold. I mean, there's not necessarily a single other. There's always otherness. And in fact, if you just think about it about casing, although at first that's an introduction of otherness, it can fall back into everydayness and actually you lose a kind of otherness, right? And in fact, there becomes practical considerations that after it undergoes otherness, it may need to fall into a stable practical use precisely so that you can function. If everything kind of stays in a perpetual creativity, it's never going to be realized into anything. But the key is even just knowing that things can be reconstituted and that they can be creatively transformed changes the mode by which people carry themselves. Because when you think that what things are is given, you carry yourself in the world in a certain way. But if you think things are instead, they are created as the way they are, well, then you carry yourself in the world in a different way because you're a different agent. The question you were asking on the nature of the context. So this would get into the question of when we talk about, say, a non-rational society. There's kind of two ways that one asks questions of like making society, which is very dangerous to discuss. But obviously, there's something like that needs to occur. And Hegel warns that, you philosophers should not plan the future and they shouldn't do these things. But at the same time, there's a sense in which you plan the future if you learn how to interpret the world differently because you change how you carry yourself in the world. So there's the question of non-rational society as something that is built like kind of an engine, or to use Hayek's example, or is it more like a greenhouse where one is setting up the conditions where then people choose to develop and grow themselves, right? Because the moment we start talking about like, well, it's an engine, well, that runs the risk of being oppressive or forceful or deciding the context for people at which point they should end the debate about the bookcase or who should be part of the conversation, right? Whereas instead, if the non-rational society is something that is instead creating conditions so that people equipped with the knowledge of their creative participation due to essential negativity, essential incompleteness, then in that creative becoming choose to use that in X way versus Y way, well, that would be more like a greenhouse where people are kind of given the freedom by which to design and to choose the contexts by which they want to become themselves and what they want to do. So there's going to be some variation between what people are going to do and what contexts they're going to be concerned about. The issue then becomes between those variations, how do we involve the natural thing to do once you create a community of a certain context with certain values is to close off to everyone else, right? To kind of say we're right and they're wrong because, well, that we think the way we do. If we didn't think the way we do, we wouldn't create this community, right? So it's very natural in that context to then self-enclose. So the difference here, and one could say that the design of the American system, if we follow a Hayek or some of the people like that, is it's supposed to be a greenhouse structure, right? You give people freedom, they do with the freedom what they want. We don't tell them what to do. We don't design an outcome. We let the outcome emerge, right? Well, the difference between, say, the non-rational, you see, what has happened, though, is it has turned out that the operating principle that people go by in order to determine their emergence cannot be, say, a firm grounding, or after the meaning crisis, people don't have the same first principles, right? So what today would be the new potential shared community or shared principles of which people can emerge in light of seeing that they can't have the same grounding. And this is where intersuppositional seems very important. This is where the sort of thinking of somehow I am choosing the context of creating values in favor of, say, if we just use a term, like some sort of Christianity, but what would it mean for the Christian to, say, be AB as opposed to AA? And that's kind of the big question, right? Because the Christian who, say, is AA, the answer would be, well, I would like everyone to be Methodists. I would like everyone to share my first principles. But if you start talking about, say, the atheist who's AB, an AA atheist would be like, well, I think, God, it's stupid to believe in God. There is no God. And so everyone should become an atheist. And if they do, the world would be a better place. If you're a Christian, you say, if everyone was a Christian, the world would be a better place. And in some degree, one kind of has to somehow think that way if they believe in the certain values that they have versus otherwise. That would be the A in AB. There has to be some sort of first principles. But the question becomes, what is the function of B then for people with first principles, right? What does that mean? Well, it would be a motivate, and then I'll give it back to you because this is when it kind of changes the question of how one interacts with the other. So if you believe that your very definition requires otherness to be constituted, well, then when Christ says, love your neighbor, the first thing you would want to do is make sure you don't define your neighbor as people that think like you. If the image, and I'm just making one example because I think this is an example of how you actually would practically think different as you move to AB versus AA. In AA thinking, and I'll just use the tradition of Christianity because that's one that comes to mind from my own experience. So if you're a Christian in your AA thinking and Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, it would be very natural to think of your neighbor as the person who lives next door to you. Okay. Like that would be your neighbor. Well, the issue though is in AB thinking, you would step back and go, well, hold on. My neighbor has a white collar job, attends a different church, but they're still Christian. They have a similar family structure and they like football too. Well, maybe they're not really that different. Maybe they're not really that other. And if I'm going to be a Christian that takes AB seriously, the neighbor, I must be very skeptical to have the neighbor be a mirror image or something similar to myself, because that would have the love probably be just serving my ideology or serving my worldview. And so you start to be more skeptical about who you define as neighbor. You tend to go, wait a minute, my brain is in the business of AA. So it's going to be very natural for me to interpret love neighbor in a manner that has me love people like me. Well, am I really then open to the other, or am I actually just using someone in a different body who's like me to confirm me? So one thing that would happen is a transformation of like a certain skepticism about how values are interpreted. So when, what would be natural to do is to interpret values in a manner that feeds your ideology, or that's easier because it's easier to encounter people like you. Where if you take AB seriously, you're going to be making sure your values are not, you're going to be more aware of how your values are serving an ideology. And here's the thing, in an AB society, other people will be doing the same thing. And so there's going to be a shared solidarity in everyone having that skepticism of their values as being in service of AA thinking versus AB thinking. And so then what they're looking for is to be sure that they're trying to do better and better at encountering the other and greater otherness. And thus they're looking for their justification in something intersuppositional as opposed to something that is more presuppositional. Because the thing is, if you define your neighbor as the person that lives next to you, well, that's kind of the ground you already live in a sense. Like there's a sense in which practically you're just saying how you already live your life is the ground of your beliefs because they live there. But once you start talking intersuppositional, that means you have to go out. That means you have to go beyond. That means you have to go to where you're not already situated, right? And look for something that is going to force a change in who you are through that difficulty. And then, of course, there would be increasing levels of otherness, of difficulty, of ways to do that. Now, and so that would be, and then there are more that would come to that, but that would be one example of how taking AB seriously would have a person reflect back on themselves and to see how they're using their values to make sure they're not using them in service of enclosedness. And then the other people would be having the shared context of doing the same, right? And to be working from that. So that would be some thoughts I had.
That makes me think that when you go beyond and then you come back to yourself, what happens is the ground in which you are coming back to, that the presence of that ground expands.
Yes.
So when, for me, it's, I have my own ground and I have a religious friend whose ground is different than mine, but I find appreciation in their ground, which in return actually expands my ground.
Yes.
By virtue of it taking into account the passion in which that person is grounded in.
Right.
So it seems that people are hung up on whose ground is right and wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
And not necessarily about both grounds are right. Not seeing how both grounds are right, because both grounds come from the same source of passion that generates the entire worldview that you're in.
Right.
And when you see that cause, it just makes you feel more passionate in the worldview that was afforded to you. That what you said really resonated with me. That was just like my knee-jerk thought. It tied in with that picture that I sent you. I don't know if we can bring it's. I know it's very rough looking. Are we able to bring it up on the actual screen?
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
Okay. So it's funny. Basically, when you were looking at your life, like how I drew this diagram, you have the A across, like it's completely across both both A's are across from each other. They're positioned here, and then the AB is positioned here. So the reason why I have that is because when you naturally look at something that you value, you're immediately associating it with a linear movement. It's linear in the sense that you are not stepping outside of your own passion field, if you will. You're only looking within the scope of that which makes passion exist to you.
Sure.
So when you do that, and now I'm tying this back to the value aspect that we were talking about. The value, which is like how it's purpose serving, that purpose serving is deeply dependent on the context. So there's a contextual threshold that is met in order to meet the purpose that it's supposed to be serving. Right. So if you only look at it from that linear way, the context itself is flat. It becomes very flat and non-dynamic, and
right.
It doesn't get to the actual wholeness of the perception. So it's basically half a circle. And that's why I put the AB across, because you need to kind of like go from, if here's the circle, you kind of have to go across to the other side, the other half, the other hemisphere, to actually see the whole picture. And all that does is just causes this like rebound back into your A.
Right.
And that rebound then solidifies the very thing that you're getting a glimpse at.
Oh yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to track with that circle diagram thing. If does that make sense?
That completely makes sense to me.
So real side note, just to talk about time, and like, or more so to talk about story. It's when people they're trying to make their story good, they're looking at it based off of, again, what a story is. And a story in today's world is events happening for the sake of entertainment.
Right.
So if you're looking at the content threshold being the threshold of entertainment, you can't really know what that is, because like we've talked about, I look at and this might be a little crude way of saying it, but you look at the bookcase, and like what I like when I'm entertained about the bookcase is that it's a bookcase. But no, for me, it's actually a dinner table. You lay it flat, and it's a nice, long, thick dinner table. So you can't really make an evaluation on your story being good for the sake of entertainment. It's only getting that half a circle. So to get the full the full picture, the full context threshold that's happening, you need to see that the events happening is very much happening for the sake of entertainment, and the events happening for is not for entertainment, but for meaning itself, which in story terms I call that theme. So to tie that into the conversation of the non-rational society, the only way to be in a non-rational society, it seems, is if everybody's able to look at the full circle. Yes. And if you don't have everybody look at the full circle, it won't be a non-rational society.
That's right.
So that to me, and then that goes just back to what you were just talking about, like how to get people to see that full circle. I just want to clarify that before like moving on to like, I guess, particular things about the non-rational society, because I think if we understand how like from an economic standpoint, why we're not getting the full context and making the evaluation of what is a good economic decision, just like with the story, how it becomes a flat decision and it's not actually good.
Right.
It's not actually, it's not getting at what makes it, like, first, I guess it would be, what is like the economy, the purpose of, what is the purpose it's serving? It would have to be agreed on what that is. And just the context in which that society is the society. What is that context? Because for everyone that's different. That's what I'm getting hung up on, in terms of everyone seeing the full circle, because part of seeing the full circle is recognizing that everyone can see the full circle in their own way.
Right.
Like, but if you see the circle in your own way, how do you get people to agree on a way of looking at, let's say, like an economic plan,
right,
as purpose serving? You have to agree on how this is purpose serving. That to me is singular. I don't see it as like a walk as much, where the walk is a bit more
right,
ambiguous. Maybe it's equally ambiguous, and I'm not aware. But yeah, that's where my head's at with what you're saying. Does that make sense?
100%. A few things. One, this kind of idea of seeing people operating according to their own their own principles, their own passions, kind of that is similar, certainly aligns with what James Hunter called substantive democracy, which is where, instead of, say, judging people according to my worldview, I observe them following their own worldview to themselves, and I kind of stick to my worldview, and that we try to vote from that sort of shared commitment. Where it's not that you apologize for your beliefs, but you also understand that they are operating from their beliefs, and you can't say that they are wrong because they don't think like you. So in a rational society, and it's kind of ironic, then it is rational to think that everyone should think like you, because rationality, of course, is defined by what you believe is true, right? So the irony is that a rational society, of which actually, funny enough, no society actually is a rational society, because they all have a non-rational foundation. They just think they are a rational society. And in a rational society, everyone should think like me. And so it becomes a power society, and it becomes an oppressive society. It is irrational to let people think different from you, because isn't it irrational to let people believe something false? And so what ends up happening is that when you don't really have an appreciation of non-rationality, or people's own personal beliefs, first principles, things that cannot be fully rationally comprehended because they are what make rationality possible. If you don't have space for that, then you have a society of power, frankly, is ultimately what occurs. And also in a non-rational society, everyone is still operating according to what they believe is rational. They just own the fact that the foundations of their rationality are non-rational, that they are truths that they assent to or they decide they believe on, or metaphysical values for X, Y, and Z reason. And the reason today you need a kind of conscious awareness of non-rational society, even though all society is non-rational, is because practically speaking, it wasn't till, basically today, that people were aware that their beliefs are contingent. So for example, if you were in a Christian society 400 years ago, yeah, that's a non-rational society because you cannot rationally conclude that God exists. But the issue is that it was true. Christianity was quote unquote true. So it felt like a rational society because it was true. So you just did what is rational. What today, though, when the contingency of all beliefs arises, then there's two responses to that. One, a kind of nihilism where you say it's all arbitrary, or two, you say, no, just because it's contingent does not mean it's false. The issue is, though, that we all have to operate according to our own non-rational foundations. And we own that fact, and that transforms the kind of character of democracy. And the issue is that democracy, say 100 years ago, where people, knew there was difference, but the difference was minor or is more shared, well, then if the severity of difference between average Americans was, say, Baptists and Methodists, I could, as a Methodist, say everyone should think like me, and the extremity of that would not be so great because the Baptists and the Methodists, they have difference on kind of minor beliefs, but when it comes to the kind of the meat, they tend to be very similar. So the oppression of that thinking was not so great. But today, where the separations in worldviews are so vast, if people don't own their non-rational foundation, it tends to become very oppressive and very power-based. And so it becomes really important today to be assessing a person relative to the degree that they passionately or truly follow their own beliefs, right? And to compare that with to the degree you follow your own beliefs. And this may sound wishy-washy, but look, here's the thing. If you're saying, again, I just use Christianity. If you're a Christian, you believe everyone should be a Christian, then show them. Then show them, and they'll show you why everyone should be an atheist. And then we will see, right? So a non-rational society attempts to, there's nothing wrong. It depends on what we mean by it. No, it is completely unnatural to not engage in activities that influence one another, right? It's impossible not to engage in influential activities. But the difference in a non-rational society is the influence is based on showing, not kind of direct converting, like trying to convert people directly to say, oh, you need to become X, Y, and Z because if you're not an atheist, you're an idiot, right? Well, if atheism is the best worldview, then create the best art, create the most compelling family structures, create the most compelling societies, and then the Christians will do the same thing, and the beauty will attract. The beauty becomes the method of influence, not a sort of like attack on the other person. In AA societies, people try to influence one another. Basically, well, it can get dark, right? Manipulation, insult, force, or they try to intellectually show why atheism is stupid or why Christianity is stupid. And then there's apologetics and all these Richard Dawkins versus Craig debates or whatever. And you get this like apologetic culture, right? Now, I'm not saying that there's never any place for the atheist to show why atheism is better than Christianity. That's fine. But there's a difference between apologetics as examining the internal consistency of beliefs and apologetics as trying to convert other people, right? A non-rational society is one that instead views terms of influence as beauty and attraction, where everyone is trying to be true to their ground, and then the light will shine forth and people will be attracted to what they are attracted to. So that's a different structure of influence. Now, that would be the dare I say, the personal and kind of metaphysical dynamics that emerge in a substantive democracy between people socially. The level that you're pointing out is the problem of law and the problem of sort of saying everyone, for example, has to believe in X, Y, or Z social issue, right? And that's where you start getting the conflict. There is no doubt that a non-rational society is going to be one in favor of less law than more. Because law is very, very blunt. You know, if you say everyone has to pay 20% tax rate, there is no differentiation, say, between who believes that a 20% tax rate is going to get less tax revenue because there's less productivity and people that have otherwise. Once you get in the realm of law, you are going to be sifting to something that seems more quote unquote apologetic or getting into what is the actual evidence. So there's a few things with that. If you go into law, it better be falsifiable. Like, this is where I would say science, because science has actually with questions of law, something more like a scientific method actually becomes a really, really big deal. And a big book on this that I love is Jonathan Rout's Kindly Inquisitors, and he's very much indebted to Karl Popper. And although I think Popper's open society critiques of Plato and Hegel and continental philosophy is very problematic, his notion of systems of organizing knowledge from beliefs and existentially grounded law, I think, is really, really important, because in law, you have to have a process that makes everyone feel from the metaphysical ground that this blunt instrument is fair. If we're going to say, for example, that that drugs should be legal, right, and everyone should allow drugs, and nowhere is it valid to not let people have drugs. Well, Christians may think drugs are terrible, right? And now they feel like they have to exist in a society where everyone is allowed to drink, to have drugs. So they may not like that. So it is extremely important that the system of legalization feels justified to Christians, and that that the legalization of it is a fair thing to go forth, right? And what that would have to do is get, frankly, into a really important distinction between knowledge and belief that really comes out. Belief is a principle that may be true, that cannot be necessarily verified by anyone else. So, for example, what makes a scientific conclusion following Rauch is the notion that anyone would have seen the same thing in the laboratory. Like, if it was you, if it was me, if it was John down the street, doesn't matter who the subject was, they would have seen the same result. Okay? The reason why this is very important is because this is what constitutes knowledge, because it is not subject dependent. Okay? It is knowledge. A belief is not necessarily false. No one's saying a belief is false, but it is more subject dependent. A belief is something that can be contingent upon the scope or individuality of the person in process. So, what Popper wants to say is that wherever you have law, it has to be in the realm of knowledge, not subject dependent, as opposed to belief dependent. Because if it's belief dependent, well, then it feels arbitrary. But if you very, very clearly say, no, we only codify things into law of which can be based on knowledge, or it creates an equal playing field, which is a loaded phrase, I know, but where people can dynamically unfold the way that they want. So once we start moving into law, we're going to have to get into key distinctions between belief and knowledge, because even though some people may not like the knowledge, the fact that there's a clear epistemological criteria of what goes into law, which means it is not subject dependent, makes it more existentially, it makes it something that people can more existentially readily handle, and live with.
So with that said, this is why I think story, I don't know if this is what you meant by foundation in talking about just like a worldview of story as a foundation, I think
Yes.
is like a very interesting dimension, just because you can have knowledge of a story. There is a valid, like science is a valid story in the
Yes.
sense that they have a beginning, they have everything that meets what a story is. They have, well, there's a future, there's stuff to come. Christianity, you have a beginning and what's to come. You know, you have an end. I try to say end in a very Heideggerian way, just to not have the absolute end per se. But all these different alterologies are valid stories. So,
Right.
but they're belief based.
Right.
Like why you choose one over the other is your personal preference. So if you have a foundation where the worldview is story based, then you can have that aspect of law where it's like, okay, this is a valid story. This is permissible under what it takes to be a story in general.
Sure.
And it affords the individual to keep their individual belief.
Right.
So it's not saying that stories are just completely imaginary and made believe, but it's just, again, reframing what it means, what a story means as your world makeup, the binding ground
Yeah.
of yourself. So to tie back, and then I'll pass it back to you, because I just wanted to make this comment with what you're saying. It's the proper foundation for a non-rational society is, like you were saying, hundreds of years ago, people were living in a non-rational society under everyone was, Christian. There was that one Christian thought. But if we could have that same thing where we live in a non-rational society where everyone operates under story.
Yeah. Right.
And what that means, it's just dynamic. Like
Yes.
Christianity, though wonderful, it's not dynamic in the sense that it rejects other stories. Like,
Oh yeah.
right?
Well, the issue is in an AB society, then basically you're if you fail to be open to the other, you lose dynamicy. You fail. You go into the negativity you mentioned at the beginning becomes an effacement. But the negativity to be an openness, you have to be open to everyone else in their story. And I think story is a powerful language, because right now it's like the thinking is, oh, people all have their worldviews by which it means like right and wrong, and they're wrong and we're right. But if you start thinking about world stories or stories that, well, then that transforms. Oh, they live that story, we live this story. And that changes things. And if you think your story is best, well, then you live it best. You show it best. I do think, as a note, in AB thinking, there is also something that will shift, is a way of looking at each one of these individual stories in a manner that makes space for the other. So, for example, I've heard Peter Kreeft say that, where you say, where you interpret, say, Christianity in a manner that looks for openness, right? Where you say, okay, well, as a Christian, you believe that, say, Jesus is the only way to heaven. And that would mean that Jesus had to die on the cross to redeem the world. But that is open to possibly everyone, because are you really going to set boundaries on God's grace as a Christian, right? That's kind of heretical, right? And you see in AA thinking, you would say something like, only people who say have these beliefs as a Christian are saved, right? Where in AB thinking, you can certainly say, no, Jesus was unique. That was the person of God, and he did something that uniquely connected the world with God. But what you do is you step back, though, and say, and I am not in a place to set limits on how God's grace would operate. I'm going to instead emphasize where Jesus says, take care of the orphans, love your neighbor, be not afraid, and emphasize these ways of life. Okay, so there's a shift on your emphasis. Now, on the flip side, I mentioned this to Dimitri. There's a version, like there can be a form of, say, liberal Christianity that wants to say like hell and justice don't exist, right? But then that actually could be evil, because don't you think Hitler should be in hell? Is it really always bad to have some sort of doctrine of judgment? So what I'm pointing out there is that in A-B thinking, notice how there's an effort to not just say Christianity is, oh, you know, Jesus was just another spiritual teacher. No, you're a Christian, so you believe he's unique, right? But you're also open to God doing things that are unexpected, otherness, openness, and that you're therefore not closing off the possibility of other stories somehow participating in that Christian story in ways you don't understand. That way of and I think you can go into Islam and emphasize that in the final judgment, Allah's wrath is overcome by his mercy. There are many Muslim Sufis and different people that talk about that, and how that Allah would have opened to many people of different stories and different thinkings, right? And I think you can move, and then you'll have some Hindus that'll talk about different avatars of, say, Vishnu or Brahman or different people. And then also you can have a form of atheism that still sees value in religious belief, even if you think it is all wrong. In A-B thinking, what you see there is not an effort to kind of cheapen religions, but a way to stay true to them while not putting limitations on the role of the other, right? And that is, I think, a very different metaphysical move than, say, a deep fundamentalism that closes off the other, or a kind of liberalism that just says that, oh, it's all relative anyway, right? So that is an important move in A-B thinking that makes a substantive democracy. There's substance to the different stories. There is uniqueness to the different stories, but they all within their unique story work to be open to the other, because the thing is, the Christian truly does benefit from interacting with the atheists. The Christian truly does benefit from interacting with the other, and they think differently and they act differently. They literally are better for it. And that goes for the Democrat that befriends Republicans and the Republicans that befriend Democrats. Literally, failure to be open to the other impoverishes you. You are less dynamic. It goes back to your graph. You are literally, your story is much less interesting. Your story is less.
You're half a circle.
It's half a circle. And so in order to get a full story and thus have a full ontology and thus turn the negativity into an openness, you must be open to the other in a powerfully important way. Now, all of that we just described is the dynamics of the interactions between stories, right? So now the question becomes, when you move into the society, how do you determine law? Well, right. That has to move from the realm of story or belief to the realm of knowledge. Like, what is conclusions that are not subject dependent? Now, this becomes very difficult, because then you get the question of who does the research. What do you do if people don't believe they're what if people believe that scientists are all corrupted by the grant system? What if people believe that the college system, the data they collect, has an ideological agenda? What if people believe that their data resources are not things that can be believed in, right? This gets into, so you have the legitimization crisis on the social level, which we have been describing and generally put an outline. Now you have the question of the legitimization crisis, as Habermas talks about, on the institutional level, right? Because if the only way to have law that doesn't feel unfair in a manner that's going to incentivize people to turn against it is to base it in the realms of knowledge, well, then the question becomes, do people trust knowledge? Do people trust studies? Or do they think that's all been corrupted? And that's, I think, a problem we have today.
So this is really a proposition that I could be so wrong about, and please, tell me. So the reason why I think looking at story is really important with this different lens of knowledge is that you could make a law, make laws vary depending on the knowledge of the given story.
Yeah,
so
right,
like
right.
you can know a story. Like there are like real deep rooted things that all stories have, that it's like Hitler would go to hell, because if you look at the story in which he's grounded in, Catholicism,
Right.
that story has guidelines that are in the story.
Right.
And like we know that his ground is actually a story, because when you examine the story, you're able to find knowledge within
Yes.
it.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
therefore you can extract laws in that subjective realm and put it in an objective place, where here's where I feel like people might not buy into it. It's when it gets into this objective place and they're not part of that story,
right,
and they're looking at that outcome, they're like, wait a second, that's an easy outcome, that's a light outcome. Maybe I should join that story so I can do X behavior for the sake of, if I do get in trouble, it's not as bad of an outcome. But I would say in response to that you're not actually in a story.
No, and that would be AA thinking, because you're
thinking of it in terms of your own enclosure and beneficial to you.
Exactly. So I would say part of the foundation shift is that it's like you look at, and we're just using Christianity just because we've been using it.
Sure.
You look at, for example, Christianity, and you say Christianity is true and real, and it's my ground of being, and I need to understand this to the rest of the world as story. This is how people can understand me, and not take it any more than that. And when you look at things like that, you can conduct evaluations where you can say, like, I think you can evaluate if someone is actually grounded in a story. Like, right. You can evaluate, just like what you're saying, if someone has that thought of like changing ground, like that's a clear case of someone not actually in the ground.
Right.
So like there's a lot of benefits to looking at the story where you can actually make judgments on whether they are in the story, and if they are in the story, you can provide laws or knowledge to adhere them to some ethics given the story that they're in.
Completely.
So in that sense, that's why, to go back to what we were saying earlier, it's like a semantic thing.
Right.
Like it's simple. It's as simple as just saying, like, if I'm an atheist, like that is just my story. But like for some reason, when people hear that, it's like, are you just saying this is make believe, that this is just nothingness? So that's why, like, I'm trying to make such an effort in trying to literally just change how people fundamentally understand story for the sake of trying to tap into this non-rational society. Because I just want to say one more thing. I just don't know from the semantic point of view, and maybe there's a different point of view that I'm not taking into account that can afford me this like a dynamicness in a society, but I just don't see another semantic, like I don't see a way of getting there without this like semantic change of like emphasizing story in this particular way. Like I just don't see any other way, but I don't know if that in itself is AA thinking, because I'm not seeing any other way of of getting to that place. So it's like, just to follow that thought for a second, it's just it would be, if you don't think about your stuff in terms of story, in the real sense of story, then you can't be a part of society. That sounds a little AA to me. So that's just a question. I'm not really sure.
A few things.
Yeah. So,
first
sorry.
Off,
go ahead.
First off,
I'm a huge fan of your thinking on story because I think that's an incredibly useful language. I have in the past talked about the problem of internally consistent systems and the notion that everyone has an internally consistent system. Say Christian, there is no essential contradiction in the worldview of, say, Christianity or Islam. And yet there are many internally consistent systems. And the question is, why do you ascribe to yours versus another person? And that gets into a certain series of questions. And it is extremely important to understand that within and relative to an internally consistent system, there is a right and wrong. Judgment is possible. It is not arbitrary. Likewise, well, the issue is if you write a story, if you've ever tried to make a story or to really examine a story, you know there is a quote unquote objective right and wrong relative to the rules of the story, how it unfolds, what occurs. It is not just a fictional creation. And so when we start saying that everyone has different stories, the key to that is it's a middle space between kind of objectivity and subjectivity, or, it's a middle space. And that is what is needed. It's a kind of condition, I talk about conditionalism. There's a certain conditionalism in operation. If you believe X, then you meet the condition of being in X, and within X, this is good, this is false, this follows, this doesn't follow. A story brings with it a logic. Now, reasons why that language, though, the other thing, I don't think it is AA, though, because you are using story in a manner that is not typically used. AA is where you take story and say, we're going to make a Hollywood movie with it. You're talking about using story as a mechanism of social organization. So that is already a making story encounter otherness. It is a bringing it into another realm and making it become other in its function. Now, it would be AA if you said this story is the one everyone should have, and society should have this story. But when you're talking about the greenhouse, that's AB. The key is AB is very greenhouse. It's much more a greenhouse than an engine you're designing, right? So you're making a greenhouse, and you're saying society to be AB must meet the conditions of being AB. Well, that's not AA. You're just saying that AB actually has conditions that make it AB instead of AA, right? And that tends to be a greenhouse. So that's not AA. The other reasons why this language is probably, it strikes me as very likely to be effective is precisely when I say my story is Christianity. It's exactly because there's a certain arbitrariness to it that then makes it open to the other. You go, wait a minute, are you just saying it's a story? Yes. Oh, well, I guess I don't have to hate you then, because it's just a story. So I don't have to think that you're wrong. Well, why do you believe in that story? It makes me think of Guy Senstock, who I spoke to the other evening in one of his talks with circling. He makes this fascinating point where often in circling, they'll use the language of imagine instead of feel, think, etc. So for example, if I say to you, hey, I feel like when you look away from me that you dislike me, that strikes you a certain way. If I say to you, hey, when you look away, I think that you dislike me, that strikes you a certain way. And in both of those situations, people don't tend to respond well if I say that to you. But of course, this is a problem because one of the problems with relationships is there's not transparency and people don't understand one another. But if I say to you instead, when you turn your head, I imagine that you're upset with me. That changes everything. And what Guy talks about is over years and years, when you get people to use the language of imagine instead of think or feel, then people feel like you're inviting them into a conversation. Because if I say to you, I imagine you're upset with me, you go, no, I'm not. No, oh, that's funny. Why do you imagine that me turning my head means you're upset with me? And now it's like a discussion. But when I say I feel like, then you feel like you have to apologize because you made me feel something, right? Like if I feel rejected, the conversation kind of dies because now you feel bad for turning your head, right? And if I tell you that I think you dislike me, well, then you're kind of upset because like, well, you're wrong. So when I use the language of think, you tend to respond with it's wrong. When I use the language of feel, you tend to respond with like, I'm sorry, an apology, and people shut down. But when I use the language of imagine, you feel invited to discuss why I interpreted that way. And so the point the guy brings out is that the language of imagining is insanely useful for interpersonal relationships. When couples learn to start saying, I imagine you think, I imagine you as being upset with me, or I imagine that you don't care about this. Well, then it's like a meta discussion about why you imagine that. And so the dynamics change radically. And certainly it seems to me that if people were to literally say, you know, my story is Christianity, that's a very different dynamic that follows versus if I say, I think Christianity is true, or I feel that Christianity is true. That transforms the interpersonal dynamics radically. And so I definitely think that that is a kind of language from empirical. You could argue it's tested based on circling dialogos, interpersonal dynamics, that this is not an arbitrary thing, that there's literally results that have been seen. And that would be an example of knowledge more than belief. Like, it's actually almost more of a matter of knowledge that using imaginary language tends to give you better response than using feel or think language. And that would constitute knowledge. The other thing I wanted to note, the distinction between knowledge and belief, that's based on Jonathan Rauch. And he, again, knowledge you don't believe in, who cares? And belief that isn't knowledge, that's risky too. So this isn't an either or thing. It's about the nature, the epistemological difference between knowledge, which isn't subject dependent, and belief, which is subject dependent, or it's dependent on doing certain things. Like, again, knowledge, anyone can go in the laboratory, they do the experiment, they get the same result. A belief can be different. The way a belief unfolds can change based on your emotional mood. Like, if you go to a church angry, then you may not get the same result as someone who doesn't go to church angry. That's why it's a belief. And maybe it's part of the belief that you have to have a certain emotion to have the experience. So the fact you didn't feel anything doesn't invalidate the belief, but the belief becomes much more contingent, right, than the knowledge. And so that distinction, but he's certainly not saying that one is better than the other. But anyway, the language of story really changes things. And then the question of law can be determined relative to story, right? Then the question becomes, though, scale. Because then you can have law for Rustburg, Virginia versus law Virginia versus United States of America versus world, right? And that's where you can get some overfitting, because you can have law on the national level that butts against law on the local level, and that causes different problems, right? And for good and for bad. You know, this is the federalist system, goods and negatives. It would seem as if, though, if people thought in terms of story and saying law must always create a greenhouse that creates the condition of stories to be realized and to operate, then law would think about itself quite differently, as opposed to currently people are like, law is about making sure people do what's right. Law is about making sure that people don't do what's wrong. That's a very different approach to law versus law being the necessary infrastructure that makes possible a collection of stories to operate, determine knowledge for themselves, to change, to spread, to interact, right? Law as ecosystem versus law as structure. That seems to be a very different approach. Now, of course, there then would have to be debate about if X law. So, for example, is a law to legalize all drugs a matter of helping people explore different stories? Or is it a violation of people's stories that think drugs are bad, right? Well, if I were to use that as a thought experiment in a non-rational society, to use that phrase, certainly someone who has a story where drugs are bad would then exist in a story where they do not do drugs, right? But other people may come from tradition where drugs, certain drugs or psychedelics or different things, were how they had access to the divine, right? So if you have a law that says no one can do psychedelics, you are certainly going to be turning off story material for some people, right? So seeing as the people who are in a story where they don't believe in psychedelics, the law isn't everyone must take psychedelics. Well, that would be a violation of story. The law, though, that says people are not allowed to do psychedelics would open story possibility, right? So that would be a reasonable proposition for a national law as opposed to just a local law. Now, let's say, though, you pass a local law on psychedelics And after 3 years, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the majority of people on psychedelics suffer, say, mental depression, or they suffer unemployment. They don't get jobs or different things. Well, at that point, you may step back and say, well, it looks as if psychedelics actually have some negative consequences we didn't call for. Well, now you have to have a debate, though. You say, well, they chose to take it. Are we going to cut people off who had beneficial stories because of the 20% of people that had a negative outcome? You would say the following. You'd say, okay, maybe we don't ban it, but we make very widespread the information of these stories so that people can make better decisions. Because if you take these psychedelics and your brain gets screwed up, you're not going to be able to create a story. So the way you would go through the results and the information would all be relative to what cultivates story and what gets in the way of story, right? Like, and you would say, okay, well, since this may hurt some people's story, but also it could help others, we're going to radically be transparent on the studies that we have done to show that it has some unintentionally negative impacts, right? And you would go from there, so on and so forth. Now, the other thing is there is possible for people to do stories that are bad, like some people can be in bad stories, and then you have to decide, is the state in the business of keeping people from being in bad stories? Or is it simply in the business of keeping people in their stories from negatively impacting people in other stories, right? And you would think through that, right? So, for example, you could take a controversial issue like gay marriage, right? And everyone has their views on that. Well, you step back and you say, okay, if we use the word marriage, there tends to be a lot of religious people who are very big, say, on what marriage is to them. And if we say everyone has to define marriage in terms of the LGBT community, well, that can make people feel like they're forced to participate in a social story they don't want to be in, right? But you step back and you say, but at the same time, if you have LGBTs that don't feel like they can live their story because they're not able to, say, share tax forms or go to the hospital or different things, then that would be infringing on those stories. So you step back and say, well, maybe the government should, because a lot of it has to do with the taxation, right? So you say, well, maybe the government should actually have all of these legal parameters in terms of living together, shared residency, as opposed to the word marriage, right? So the government says, well, we're going to, instead of talking about, say, marriages or spouses, you can start talking about shared residency. Because what about, say, the uncle that, say, takes care of their niece and their nephew, right? Should they have different legal requirements? Or what about two sisters who live together, right? Should they not be able to share property in the same way that a marital couple could be? And so you start as a state going, okay, well, if we got out of the business of describing, say, tax benefits in terms of marriage, then we could expand shared residency and different tax benefits in hospitals, therefore including people that don't agree with the Christian view of marriage, but then at the same time not make Christians feel, or Muslims or so on, that they have to redefine marriage because the government is out of the business of talking about marriage and is instead in the business of cohabitation. That's the term I was looking for. So the government says we're going to do our policy in terms of cohabitation versus marriage. So what have you done there? You've gone through thinking, how do we not impede upon people's stories while simultaneously enabling story? Well, one can do that by redefining the law in terms of and that would also help, say, sisters who live together, and thinking in terms of cohabitation as opposed to marriage. And then if people in their own individual stories want to say we're married or we're not married, well, then they can in their own individual stories do that. So that would be an example of thinking through a topic in terms of story that would then legally help you avoid well, what we have today, right? Because when you're thinking in terms of right and wrong, marriage is X or marriage isn't X, well, then you as the state are in a role of imposing that vision upon everyone, right? Because the point of the law is to make sure everyone's right. Problematically, not everyone shares that view, and then they get mad and they tend to turn to a strong man, and then we get totalitarianism, right? That's the other thing. Like, if one is not willing to transform their structure in the way we are talking, you will get a response. It tends to be a popularist uprising. You tend to get a breakdown of the social order if you don't figure out a way to create a space for many stories, right? It It's not something where you can say, well, that's nice, Dan, but we'll do something else. No, we know what happens if you don't do that. You get a backlash. So those are two examples that just come to mind on a way to make space for many stories, to be open to those different possibilities, while at the same time not trying to avoid having people feel like that their story is not one that they are allowed to be in their world. Now, of course, then you get into the issues where you say, hey, you cannot force people that don't agree with your story to live as if your story is true. And then you have laws for people that are, say, holding a gun to someone's head and saying you must take psychedelics or you must do X, Y, and Z. That would not be legal. But why would that not be legal? Because you're forcing someone into a story. See what the, so this is the thing. You now have, like, just like you were saying, you now have a new kind of source of legitimacy for law, right? Instead of it being on terms of, say, right and wrong, because then that becomes oppressive, the legitimacy of the law becomes what is infringing upon story creation, what is infringing upon the relation between stories or imposing one of the stories on one another. Well, that's a legal system that is intersuppositional as opposed to presuppositional. And you're looking for how to maintain the relations between the differences without the differences imposing one another. And that becomes an ecosystem. That becomes a greenhouse. That becomes a very different ballgame. But law right now is kind of confused because people know that they're not supposed to think everyone should think like them, but then they don't have an intellectual framework where they can act in a manner that doesn't basically say everyone should think like them. Like democracy right now is very confused because if everyone has an Enlightenment metaphysics where there's right and there's wrong, and if you don't think, well, then how can you actually believe that it's good that people don't think like you? Like, it's not possible. It's not possible by AA thinking. So democracy becomes a kind of lie, or it doesn't know what it's doing. Democracy doesn't know what it's doing. It's very pathological. We all say democracy is good, but in the back of our minds, we're like, but I'm not sure how. And look, you see all the youth are like anti-democratic. You're like, a lot of younger people are, when anonymous, say they don't support democracy. Well, you can't blame them. It doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's a really, why is it good that people think, why is it good that people who don't agree with you have a view? Isn't that bad? Following the Enlightenment paradigm, it is. But a story paradigm, it's the stuff of life. So that switch of thinking from AA to AB is basically, in my mind, the only way that democracy has a chance. Because otherwise, democracy just doesn't feel intellectually coherent. What I talk about is it creates what I call a conflict of mind. Basically, the whole first book of The Truth and the Rational is to go through to show how autonomous rationality ultimately creates an internal conflict with itself that leads to an instability that devours itself. And the key examples of the paper, The Conflict of Mind, is in fact democracy. Democracy under AA thinking cannot sustain itself because it can't make sense of itself. It can't make sense of what it's doing. Nor can law. And so then what ends up happening, law doesn't know what it's doing. And law's like, well, we're here to protect difference and democracy and diversity, but we're also in the business of right and wrong. And so there's confusion. But if you start saying, no, democracy and law are matters of story and creating the conditions of story, and democracy is what arises as the agreement of the power over all the stories based on what we think is best to incubate those stories so that they relate to one another and allow people to passionately follow their story. Okay, all right, I can start to make sense of this. And then the language of story versus worldview and ideology then does the Guy Senstock stuff where people feel more comfortable with. It's like, oh, that's your story. Why do you feel that way? And then that in of itself, I think, is interpersonally healing.
That was great. You said a lot. Let me just, I know you're not feeling well. So
I always enjoy speaking with you. I never know where the time goes.
I could really keep going. So just stop, whenever you, no harm, no foul. Okay, let's see. The first thing, yes, I agree. Like my initial questioning of can the story potentially turn into its own AA? I don't think that will happen either. Yes, because what you said, but also just to use my own math machine, like there's so many different. A story is just a possibility. So there's I can't tell you how many different stories there are. There's going to be this constantly new discovering of different stories. So it's going to be a constant updating of like the laws, like the spotlight of the law, if you will. Oh, there's this new story. Okay, now let's see how this story operates and what law should conform to that particular new operation that has arisen.
Yes.
That seems to be what's going to happen. What I do think is there are bad stories, and what I mean by bad stories are basically just not stories.
Right.
Like they're just not stories. Like and this is something, Alex and I will definitely talk about in the book. It's just they're not bad stories. They're just half circles. They're just literally dope. Like we've talked about this, like from a pure, movie entertainment industry standpoint, it's just dopamine. It's just dopamine sequences that evoke dopamine reactions.
That's right.
There's no sense of return. There's no sense of wanderment after the story, which calls for that return in the first place, because you wander away from the realization that's occurred from embarking on the journey, and then you eventually kind of forget that feeling that you get when you realize like the theme. So you return back to it just to get a new sense of the theme. But what's going to happen is when there's these new discoveries of stories, there's going to be an ethics to how to discover a story. Not saying that there's only one way in which you can discover a story, because everybody discovers a story from their own phenomenological, from their own positionality. So I think there's these, like, I don't want to use technical hallmarks, but just for the sake of talking concisely, there's these technical hallmarks where the theme needs to be present through and throughout. And if it's not, then the law, in the discussion we're talking about, the law can't consider it a story. So to me, in this society, what would society look like when you present your ground and the society doesn't view it as a story? Like, are you able to be operating in a society where your story is in question like that? Like, I think, like, the Christian story it's not in question in terms of how I'm talking about it. Like, when I'm talking about a story is like I'm thinking about it really much like a screenplay. So, like, bear with me here. When I'm reading a bad screenplay, it's not necessarily that, like, there's no theme that's present. It's that the unfolding of the story isn't unfolding. It's just almost like bullet points sometimes. So there's no actual. It's telling me what's happening, but it's not describing to me what's happening. And that's bad. That's a bad script if it's just flat up. Sarah is happy. Can't say that in the script. Like, that's not appropriate to a script. You have to just, Sarah has a smile. Like, you can infer happiness from the smile, but you can't say happiness itself. So, like, there's this phenomenological, there's this artistic, descriptive way in which your story needs to unfold in order for it to be a story. So, like people listening to this, let's say they have like more of a religious background, like Christianity, and they're thinking, well, atheism, it's crude. It's not taking into account like God, which is really crude. So from that perspective, so wouldn't you be thinking that that's not actually a story because it doesn't have that unfolding mechanism that perhaps Christianity has? And I would say that it does have the unfolding mechanism, because it makes you think about other stories in a way where you don't have to believe in it. Like, it's unfolding in a way where it meets the standards in which you think you have a ground to stand on. So that can't just be saying like, oh, there's no God. Like, if you listen to Richard Dawkins talk and people ask him questions like, how could you think that there's no God? Where did all this come from? Why is something other than nothing? He will give you the atheist unfolding of that. He will give you the answer to that. And it's not just as simple as like, here's a few bullet points. It's like, take into account these factors of the environment creating the type of affordance that gave us and gave us the ability to then think of the world in a certain way, and gives this more evolutionary understanding of what's occurring. That evolutionary understanding, to me, is equal to the unfolding of the Bible. It has a beginning, middle, and a what's to come, so to speak. So I just wanted to make that point. I also really like what you said about Guy. I gotta watch some of his videos. I really like the Imagine. That was good because it really. I'm trying to emphasize on language and a dictionary of invitation. Put it that way, where story, to really get at the core of what story is, there's a different language, I believe, that is a language of invitation, that it's just completely different. It's taking into account the possibilities. It's just taking into account the possibilities, and it's taking into account the possibilities where the person that's encountering the possibilities is becoming one with the other in doing so. It's not just like, I think this, I think that it's like what you're saying. Instead of saying I think / I feel like X, imagine X, because when you do that, you put someone and you push them toward what you are doing. So when I talk about story in terms of like these like bounce and distance, it's supposed to, the idea is to push story toward its point of possible relation. Like, and what I mean by possible relation, the possibility for others to get a sense of the theme. Like, that's all you are setting up the affordance of people to get a sense of the theme, essentially. So that's the whole point of the thematic language, is this invitation, this invitation type of language. And then what you said about what's right is just so context dependent. It's like, there can't just be this enlightenment version of right and wrong. It's what's right. Well, it depends. But the funny thing is, you ask a law student, what do you learn in law school? They would say, everything depends. That's like the main thing, the main takeaway I feel like that I get with law school. But it's not, here's the funny thing, it's not a depend of a story. It's a depends in terms of an absolute knowing that's out there. It's dependent on the precedent. It's all dependent on the precedent, and the precedent has only like one outlook of what happened. That's not even an account. That's not or the ground in which each party in the case is in. That's not to say that there's some loophole where like mass murdering is okay. I would venture to say there is no story. There is no ground that actually would like support that behavior. Like, I don't see how it would call for a what's to come if you were mass murdering people. There is no actual end. It's just you're closing off possibilities with that type of behavior. So I just don't see that being a possibility. And then just this idea of the ethics in the curation of a story for the sake of a society is having basically the notion of possibility and, in my mind, theme present in every moment of your story. And that you know, the whole discussion we had with like theme and story, it's having this, you know, ontological worldview to situate your theme in, and to then have your story unfold accordingly. The ontological worldview needs to be something that is conducive to the fact that it's a possibility. So like this is where I get a little mixed up in my head. If you think about Christianity, it's hard to think about it in terms of a possibility. Same with atheism. It's like that, like what you were saying, it's impossible to like actually say like you just think your ground is the right ground and the others are wrong. Like, how do you actually break out of that? Because that is what you said. That is exactly what happens. Like, that is what's happening. You just think you're right and they're wrong, and you just like are nice and kind, and you put up with what the other person has to say. But in the back of your mind, it's like, well, they're at the end of the day, their conclusion's wrong. Like that's that. Like, for me, when I read Kant, it's like he's writing, and he has like the kingdom of the kingdom ends, right? The kingdom of ends. And I don't necessarily believe in that. I'm not sure if I do, but yeah, I do believe in other things that he says. So it's confusing. It's a little confusing to me to take into account some aspects and not believe in others, even though that the aspects that you are taking account for are deeply dependent on the things that you're not believing in the person who's coming up with the story. In their mind, it's deeply contingent. But I might say yes to this aspect, no to this other aspect. Yeah.
Well, I very much appreciate this discussion because it's making very good. First off, Guy is awesome. Love that guy. Highly suggest the circling. The term that's coming to mind is almost like story democracy, because what you were saying about possibility, yeah, it's really difficult for me to say Christianity is a possibility, but it's not hard for me to say Christianity is a story. When I say it's a story, I am saying it's a possibility, but it's solid enough where it's okay to say, but it's also not so open that it feels overly fluffy. Because at the end of the day, there is a very real sense in which talking about this non-rational society has a lot to do with particular language, particular mode, particular way of seeing. And basically, most of political activity in all of history has been in the realm of I think X or I feel Y. We don't have political exchanges that tend to use languages of I imagine X and I'm in the story of Y. That is inherently far more invitational. And it is between a kind of hard objectivity and a hard relativism. And if I say, this is my story, once you truly understand that story is substantive, that it is not arbitrary, that changes everything. Also, if I say my story is Christianity, I have a meaning. Isn't there this whole meaning crisis thing that everyone's talking about? There it is. When you only have the categories of thinking and feeling, a meaning crisis seems pretty inevitable. But when you have language of story, well, now you start talking about where people are. And it makes me also think how that language makes possible the substantive democracy Hunter and them were after, that doesn't seem possible with the language of feel and think, because it's too power-based or too emotive. The moment I say, I feel like you're wrong, I feel like, you think X, well, who are you to feel that? But if I say, I imagine that you think X, okay, well, no, that's not what I think, but let me explain. Also, one of the reasons why democracy basically fails is because people don't understand the context is of why people think the way they do. So, for example, you have a really small government libertarian, and you're like, man, he's an extremist. Well, actually, he had a business that was destroyed because the local government passed a really stupid law that had a negative consequence on the water system in his area, and he lost everything. So now he's small government. If you were him, you may be a small government libertarian too. So the issue is that when you start saying people's like the story democracy, basically that says right there that you can't understand people's values unless you know their story. So now what do you have to do? Listen. And that's also true. You don't understand why people are passionately so for example, if you got someone who's passionately against racism, they easily are in a story where the bank redlined their property and they lost everything. So, so people tend to have like stories for why they think the way they think. But you see, when you don't use the language of stories, it just feels like arbitrary opinions. Oh, I think government is bad. Oh, I think we should stop racism. It feels like something you got off of a menu. Like you just were going through a store one day and you picked up some values. But when you really get that it's all storied, well, then that also really situates listening. And also it makes you go that people have a deep reason for the way they think, because they have a story where this thing emerged and it's affected them. That sort of language also suggests that everyone is a character, not just a brain on a stick. The current democratic structure just is like everyone is a collection of beliefs that we argue about. Where in a story democracy, everyone is a character that has a narrative for why they are the way that they are. So that just completely changes how one is toward one another, and it changes the listening, and it changes kind of the entire way that you think that people come into their beliefs. They come in it through story. So when I think story democracy, that's a completely different mode, and that changes things. Now, to this issue, though, of bad stories, in a story democracy or an AB society, you basically are committed to encountering the other and thus being tested to find out if your story is good or bad. And so that's a commitment you make when you're open to the other. You're going to find out, and you're also committed to making your story good if it's bad. If you find out, you see, basically one of the reasons, there is no doubt that one of the best things you can do for your religious belief is experience people that don't share them. And you really find out if you believe them or not, or if they're lived, or if they actually have substance to them. Because you begin returning to your religious beliefs and saying, you know what? When I was growing up surrounded by other Christians, I could just emphasize the atonement. But when I'm around like people who aren't Christian, I really need to like emphasize the life of Jesus and try to be like that and not skip the entire gospel. It has and then you say, well, I need to make my Christianity a story, not just a set of beliefs. The encounter with the other will have a radical impact on making you return, like a good story, to what you think and resituating it and reintegrating it with yourself to make a story. So indeed, AB is an openness and vulnerability to finding out that your story sucks, and that it is not a good story, and that it doesn't unfold. Well, that then, if you find that out, it also brings with it a commitment to making your story something that does unfold, and therefore can more substantively and fittingly participate in the story democracy. That's basically what you're doing. You're saying, oh, my story's bad, therefore I can't really participate well in this story democracy. I'm committed to changing that. And this would address, one, the meaning crisis, because you go and get a story. Two, it would force people to create a coherent logic in which to situate their values. Three, it would make a democratic exchange that was much more interesting and dynamic because people would be talking out of a completed story, not just a collection of notions that they've gathered randomly that don't make a story. 4, everyone would have character. So what's another crisis today that people like Hunter will say? The death of character. Feels like people don't have character. There's a lack of character. You have people that have these kind of random moral, like Hunter will say, it's like people have like these moral truisms, but they don't change their life. They don't impact them. They're just like a list of rights and wrongs. So there's a death of character. Well, that begins to be adjusted. And you start to see how people can have character because they're not just heads on a stick, but if they're just heads on a stick, then of course they can't have character. They just can have notions. So story democracy is the corollary of that would be the political structure or organization of a non-rational society, because a non-rational society would be one of which sees everyone as basically in a story. That would be what it would be. Or, you know, I've called it an internally consistent system with a non-rational foundation. That's a mouthful and doesn't sound that great. And the language of story, though, is much more inviting. So thinking in terms of story democracy as one part of the conversation, because I fear I will have to run. I've enjoyed this immensely. But that seems to be a political angle by which to think of the non-rational society. Now, this leaves open economics. This leaves open other things. And indeed, thinking about story democracy, the structure of law would then be in the name of the incubation, preservation, and maintaining of those stories. And yes, you would have to have debates on what laws succeed at doing that and what doesn't. But this is possible precisely because there is, in fact, kind of, you know, you were saying that like genocide will always be wrong, right? The issue is that there are, in fact, moral absolute categories. Murder is always wrong. The issue, though, is it's not always clear what killing falls under the category of murder. So moral categories are absolute. Just phenomenon, it's not always clear what categories they fall under or not, right? So determining law is possible because you do have absolute categories, but there would have to be paying attention to what laws lead to a real close paying attention to what laws lead to an incubation and unfolding of stories versus not. And the final point, you know, you were talking about, you see, basically in a story democracy, people are not trying to figure out everyone's beliefs. Instead, they're paying very, very close attention to how individuals unfold. So Flannery O'Connor said that the writer is someone who's not afraid to gaze, to stare. The mode of democratic participation here, instead of being one of, this is what I believe, this is what you believe, and let's debate and like figure it out. And that tends to be a very aggressive structure. In a story democracy, the mode is people pay a really close attention to how they stare, like artists themselves, to see how people unfold in their story and to see what stories unfold in a manner that is good and what stories unfold in a manner that is bad. And then from a deep understanding of one another's stories in its unfolding, they can then talk from their story to that story in its unfolding. So the mode of a story democracy is not going to be debate. It's going to be far more discussion. And it's going to be a literary discussion, frankly. It's going to be a story discussion. It's going to be a conversation that is more like circling in the way that Guy Senstock is describing. That is possible because of a deep phenomenology of the story, a deep awareness and paying attention to the unfolding of the story. Well, you would just apply that to law and saying, okay, we're really paying attention to if the law helps stories unfold or not. It is, we keep it. It's not, we get rid of it. You would, of course, have to have a system of removing law, changing law, and there would, of course, be mistake. But if at least you know the metric, and this is the key. If everyone agrees on the metric, that the metric is story, not right and wrong, well, then you have a shared metric by which to carry out a judgment to determine if the law on different levels, you know, local, state, federal, succeeds at incubating stories. So to me, all of this suggests a different mode of politics and law and democracy that is different in a non-rational society, an AB society versus an AA society.
Really what is happening is we're just trying to translate into English, in my opinion, Heidegger entire notion of Dasein.
Sure.
Like, like we are playing, in my mind, like a word game, like a semantic game.
Sure.
That is just translating, it's crossing over Dasein into the Western like playground, so to speak, not American English playground, where it's, to me, I just think that I want, well, first, I'll just leave it with a question maybe for next time, but like, I wonder if the current system, the law, economic system, most systems in general, if they prioritize existence or over being, or being over existence, and to me, how story in the non-rational society is I think it's recognizing existence, but particularly waiting and allowing being to present itself in existence. So it's having this patience where it's like this listening, this, like, when you bring in the imaginary type of language, imagine this, you are inviting them into your existence, and you are waiting for being to kind of to show itself for you, in a sense, to verify your existence. Like, it's a verification mechanism for your existence in a certain respect. So I just think what we're doing is we're really prioritizing Dasein, and how we're in Dasein should be the priority in curating a society, curating a pathology of thinking, and maybe yeah, just a thinking. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Oh, I mean, to comment on that, there's definitely a way in which we're describing law as clearing, and also and also when you say I imagine, well, it's also quite clear that finding a better language makes a huge difference, exactly in the example of how people respond when I say, I feel that you dislike me, versus I think that you dislike me. Both of those have very practical results. People get uptight, people get offended, stuff doesn't go well. But if I say, I imagine you dislike me, the response is different. You say, no, I don't. There's not, it's like, no, because imagining is to show that you're willing. Like when I say I imagine, I'm saying I might be wrong. And that willingness to be wrong then is an openness. You're saying there's a negativity here. There's an openness. You can step in. And so language matters. Language makes a huge difference. And if you can have democracy operate according to a story language, then it could possibly be an efficient and successful substantive democracy, exactly as Hunter described. And again, what's so critical is Hunter says the following: if we don't figure out how to do a substantive democracy, which is where people can talk from their first principles without killing one another, we're going to end up in the West as balkanized in popularism. He wrote this in 1993. He predicted it all. It's exactly what has occurred. And he followed the abortion debate to make this point it's called Before the Shooting again, because he's like, hey, if we don't figure out how to do substantive democracy, there's going to be shooting. He was right. He was 100% correct. He warned about it. This is a matter of making sure the nation or nations do not end up in just freaking tribalism, balkanization, falling apart, violence, collapsing. So language can make that difference. A different language can make possible the difference between maintaining unity but difference, or balkanization. That's the great challenge. And I think, indeed, there's a lot of this that has to do with clearing, because if I say I imagine X, I'm making a clearing for you. I'm making an opening. Also, if I'm paying attention to unfolding, I'm paying attention to unfolding. I'm letting things unveil themselves to us, as opposed to when I say, well, because if everyone has a story, the only way I can determine if they're right and wrong is if I know their story relative to that story. So I have to pay attention. But if I think right and wrong without story, well, then all I need to know is all I need to do is figure out if they think like me. If they think like me, they're right. If they don't, they're wrong. By definition, because if you think X way, you think it's right. Otherwise, you wouldn't think it. So the language of right and wrong, of which you're stuck with in AA, necessarily requires everyone to become like you. It must. But if you have the language of story, well, then the only way to talk about right and wrong is to pay attention to their story relative to their story. And the right thing to do is for you to help them be true to that story, or to show them that their story is bad, and thus show them a good story and help them on their own become better storytellers with a hyphen, right? To become better in that unfolding. This is an entirely different mode of people carrying themselves in democracy and how one carries things about. This all in mind, the topic of economics would follow if I didn't have to run, because then the question becomes, what are the structures of investment to enable story? What are the structures of economic signaling and distribution to help people think what stories they ought to be part of and what stories they ought to invest in? How to locate other stories like theirs that they can be part of? And you would have to generate an economic signal system and pricing mechanism that would be story-based, as opposed to determining what's the right speculative investment or the wrong speculative investment, of which then unfortunately means people can generate profit without necessarily facilitating a story. Right now, economics can generate profit without necessarily concerning itself with the generation of value. And when you have a separation of value and price, you tend to get inefficiencies, in the same way that when you have a separation of right and wrong from story, you tend to get social pathology. So these are two things that align.
The classic rich person that doesn't seem to have any value in their life.
They don't have the one of the great ways to find out that you lack value is to get rich. And then you encounter boredom. Which is a great irony. In fact, they did that whole Squid Game thing based on that premise, right? Which was, says a lot about the culture. But Andrew Luber, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I look forward to our next discussion. These have been quite a joy.
It was awesome. It was awesome. Real quick, I do think it would be cool one of these days if like we get Guy, or just you and I, we get it and talk about the dictionary. Like the actual, what is the parameter in which that dimension is realizable? When you said invitation, it really like struck a light bulb where it's just like, you are talking about what I've been trying to talk about too, which is just like this type of language that shows the other, and there's different ways, like saying I feel and I think is outside of that dimension. And I think that would be a shock to most people, because when you think about, oh, you're considerate, it's like you're considerate to someone else's feelings or their thinking. But really, if you're really considerate, you're considerate to inviting them to be part of the other. That's true consideration.
Yes.
And that, it's having that vocabulary, that dictionary. To me, I would tie that under the umbrella of having this semantic, this metaphysics of semantics, or a dictionary, this something with semantics, because I think semantics, the concept of semantics, is very inviting, just inherently. When I had my professor, David Wolfsdorf, in college, he wrote the book on goodness, and that's where I get a lot of this value and context stuff and content from. A lot of it is very welcoming, because it doesn't really matter what your background or how you're coming at it, but when you approach goodness from a semantic lens, you get to the same place. I don't know if it's necessarily inviting the other per se, but I definitely think it's inviting in the sense that you, as a collective, can get to a mutual understanding.
Well, that's that's all extremely fascinating to me.
Does that make
maybe
sense?
Non-rational diction? No, it makes 100% sense. I mean, dictionary, dictionary, economics. Those are two, because as you know, economics gets into what I call economic Gnosticism. the problem of pricing horizons, etc. But I'm really interested on the notion of establishing kind of a dictionary that's using this language of imagine or story that helps be AB, because language really truly matters.
Does, yeah.
And it shapes, well, Heidegger understood that. And so it's a house of being. And so if we're talking about AB, that's a kind of house of being. So the language is going to matter a lot. So I'm down for talking about that. I think that's fascinating. I think that's also, when you start talking language, well, a lot of the stuff we're describing is in this weird middle zone between practical and abstract, where like ways of seeing actually are practical, but it's kind of in this weird space often. Language, though, is in that same weird space, but it's easier for people to see, yes, it's practical. Like, it's easier for people to see that it impacts practice, right? Because like ways of talking, people have had those experiences. So that's, you know, to that question you asked of how you get people to the place of even seeing the need for AB or engaged in AB, language would be a very good angle. You know, I think the inability of values to complete themselves is a good angle, where you push them to show that they kind of eventually need the other values, which is thus AB. But also language is a great way to bring people in, where you just have them use a different language and say, doesn't that change the atmosphere? Doesn't that change the mode? That can be a wonderful, that strikes me as a potential wonderful initial step. So that sounds fantastic to me.
Sounds good. I'll leave it for there for now.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, Andrew. I've really enjoyed this. I hope I hope we do it again very soon. Good evening.
Yep.
And thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good night, Daniel.
You too. Have a good evening. All the best.